So let me welcome everyone to the final session of our first colloquium of the posthuman, organized by the Latin American Network of Posthumanism, with two main institutions on the PUCP, the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, on the one hand, and the UCAB, Universidad Católica 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗀 in Caracas. These colloquia have been organized so far by the two different research groups, 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗄 and Maya, and groups which belong to the PUCP and the UCAB, UCAB, respectively. The 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗄 Center of Philosophical Studies contemporary works mainly on contemporary philosophy. Maya is working mainly on digital culture and contemporary aesthetics. And we started this colloquium around 6 months ago, if I'm not wrong, if I'm not mistaken. Thinking of the posthuman, beginning with technology and ethics, we had Gianluca Mauro and Kevin Larrantia working with us, sharing with us. Then we had a second session on non-human animals with 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗄𝗁 and 𝗍𝗵𝗹𝗀𝗄𝗁, who's a member of the directory of the Latin American Network of Posthumanism. Our following colloquium was body and digitality, and we had Ale Borea and Victor Krebs. Ale was from Berlin, and Victor was broadcasting from Ljubljana then. Then we had three members of our board, 𝗍𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗴 Aguirre, Lorena Rojas Parma, and 𝗍𝗵𝗹𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗍𝗫 who were sharing with us subjects on spirituality and virtuality. And now we want to, close this year sessions with the cherry on top, or should I say the apple on top? I don't know. Our three speakers for today are the three of them are live from New York. It's Saturday morning. We have Pimons Buluk, Carl and Bernice with an associate professor in Jewish and Israel Studies from Columbia University. She's a literary and movie critic, and novelist and essayist in her native France. And her current interests include Jewish thought and mysticism, interreligious encounters, the intersection between religion and the arts, and the study of the unconscious. And she's the author of, I think this is your most recent book, if I'm not wrong, Another Modernity, although I know there is a new one coming in as well, if I'm not wrong. Another Modernity, 𝗪𝗲𝗀 Venamos Ex Jewish Universalism, and she's the co-editor of the Stanford Studies in Jewish Mysticism series. We also, and her presentation is called Invisible Mind, Invisible Nature. There is a longer subtitle that you can see in the poster if you want to, which is available for you on our networks as well, on our social medias. We also have Ignacio Vinapolo. He's a Venezuelan industrial designer. He's a professor. He's a curator. He holds a master's in product engineering, and he's currently the chair of the industrial design department at Pratt Institute in New York. He's a founding member of the advisory committee of the Iberian American Design Biennial in Madrid, and he is the editor of the design portal www.𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 It's been an ongoing editorial effort for quite some time now. And his presentation is called Humanless Objects, quite suggestively. Last but not least, we have Professor Farzad Mahootian. He's a clinical associate professor of global liberal studies at New York University since 2010. He has I'm going to give it an interdisciplinary background. He has a PhD in 𝗲𝗵𝗻𝗃, a PhD in philosophy from 𝗲𝗵𝗻 University, but he also holds degrees in chemistry from Georgetown University. His research currently focuses on interactions in philosophy and science. His research interests include process philosophy, Islamic philosophy, speculative fiction, and biomimicry, artificial intelligence, and the mythological imagination of technoscience. Some of his recent publications include Ideals of Human Perfection in Sufism and Transhumanism, a comparison, Building a Better Human, Whitehead on Intuition, Intuition in Mathematics and Physics, Metaphor in Chemistry, an examination of chemical metaphor, and works on philosophy of chemistry. His presentation is called Stanisław Lem's AI Fiction. Allow me to do a little bit of housekeeping. Professor Buluk will go first. Then we will have Professor Urbina, and then we'll close up with Professor Mahootian. I would like to invite everyone in the room to take notes because we're going to keep the questions for the end. Each speaker is going to have between 20 and 30 minutes to share. I would really encourage everyone here to, take notes, write down your questions, because the idea is to keep this as colloquial. It's a colloquium, to keep it as colloquial as possible. And then we want to end up with a conversation with the three authors. We can, try to provoke some questions, but I would really like to invite people in the audience just to write down some questions and use it to, as Victor just said on the chat, use it for the conversation at the end, right? I think that this is all that I had to share with you for now. I'll leave you all with Professor Clémence Buluk. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, Professor. And you're muted.
What is a Zoom meeting without someone speaking into the voice?
I know.
So I checked the box. Now you're free to not do the same mistake. So thank you so much, Danielle, for inviting me, Victor and Danielle, for organizing this colloquium. And I'm really looking forward to learning from Farzad and Ignacio as well after this talk. So as you mentioned, the subtitle of my presentation is somewhere in some social media websites, but it's also fitting because the pre-Freudian unconscious that I'm going to be discussing today is also somewhere else. And so how does this pre-Freudian unconscious informs, or how does it inform, or can it inform our understanding of what the post-human might be, is really what I'm going to try to explore today. I'm really looking forward to your feedback. This is a new field of research for me. So this is extremely humbling and exciting. And thank you again for this invitation. So I'll be screen sharing at some point so that people get a sense of what the main 𝗬𝗲𝗀 aspects of Jewish mysticism might look like, but I'll just start out without too much screen sharing. So in his opening of the interpretation of dreams, where he introduced the concept of the unconscious, Freud wrote that the epoch that preceded him was one in which philosophy and not the exact science dominated the mind. What he was mostly referring to was Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, published in 1800, where the German philosopher articulated the notion of the unconscious for the first time, even coined arguably the term, and inflected it with mystical accents, mostly drawn from Jewish mysticism. But Freud was also aware of the work of other thinkers, such as Eduard von Hartmann, who has sunk into oblivion since then after being one of the most influential thinkers of the late 19th century, and who continued the exploration started by Schelling, and wrote this very influential philosophy of the unconscious, published in 1869. So contrary to Freud's definition of the unconscious as science, the pre-Freudian unconscious is a very fluid, a porous notion, which exposed the conflict, but also the affinity between philosophy of science, science and religion, and between the science of the mind and the natural science. And it also set the stage, and this is fitting for today, for the post-human by displacing the traditional humanistic unity of the subject and by finding a way beyond pure rationalism and irrationalism. So today I will briefly summarize the engagement of Schelling with mysticism, Kabbalah, basically, and then focus on the work of Eduard von Hartmann and see how those two authors were reclaimed by Jewish thinkers in order to offer religious apologetics in a world that was getting increasingly secular, and re-articulate the understanding of the human brain. So finally, I'll close by looking at how thinkers such as Ernst Kapp, all the names will be in my handout, demonstrated the affinity between the unconscious and technology and paved the way for the post-human. So let me just start with Schelling. So Schelling's turn to Kabbalah really corresponds to the philosopher's later part of his work. His interest for what he called, quote, the night of unconsciousness and the concept of the dark side of God and of the psyche has been widely ascribed to a broader political conservative turn in Germany and to his discovery of the 19th century German mystic Jakob Böhme. Böhme was dubbed the first psychologist by Feuerbach, and he turned a stock of metaphysical images into a description of the making and the workings of the mind. And he was particularly attracted to the concept of the abyss, which is the initial contraction of God in order to make space for his creation, his or her creation, their creation. And so by creating this void, the abyss, God created the Ungrund, the non-ground, which Schelling took to be the unconscious in history. So there is this correlation between Böhme, Schelling, and what is actually a Jewish concept. The image of and notion of this restriction of God that allows for the creation of the world and that of an abyss are also a stable of Kabbalistic imagery. This is called Tzimtzum, and that belongs to the strain of Lurianic Kabbalah, which originated in mid-16th century Safed, and something that Schelling was aware of. Here is a smoking gun. In 1815, Schelling published a small pamphlet called On the Deities of Samothrace, where it described Kabbalah as a primeval system that had lost its relevance. I mean, he's still a Protestant thinker, but that could still be used as a stock of metaphors in order to probe the relation between the mind and creation, between the mind and the macrocosm. And in this construct, the psyche must be read through a metaphysical lens. And this is what 50 years later, Eduard von Hartmann seized on. He followed suit. He strove to create this some sort of universalist hermeneutics based on the structure of the mind and on its correlation with the macrocosm. His work did draw on science and technology, but it was above all a metaphysical synthesis, which captured the imagination of his time. So Hartmann's philosophy of the unconscious was published in 1869, and it took Germany and rapidly Europe by storm, as demonstrated by the number of German editions. In 20 years, there were 10 editions, and many translations followed. In France in 72, England 82, and another index of that attraction is that this very thick book attracted sarcasm from Nietzsche, who called the author an amalgamist, and his book a philosophically roguish prank in his essay on the use and abuse of history. And through the notion of the unconscious, what Hartmann was trying to do was to reconcile the idea of the will, and Hegel and Schopenhauer. And for him, the highest phase of knowledge lies in intellectual and mystical intuition. It cannot lie in the things themselves, but in the results of this mystical intuition that he calls the unconscious. And this is mysticism. For him, both self-awareness and immediate knowledge derived from the unconscious, which is almost an autonomous category in his book, and again, a combination of Schopenhauer's will and representation. So while Freud, as Auden put it in his eulogy of the Viennese doctor, said that he merely told the unhappy present to recite the past, Hartmann was really focused on the future. He wrote about the self-destruction of Christianity. He was preoccupied with a world that was increasingly secular and that could not provide the metaphysical surroundings in which human beings, he claimed, can thrive or even survive. So basically, he said that the future, should mysticism ever disappear, was doomed, and he contemplated the end of human history. So basically, a post-humanism is also a place in which mysticism has disappeared. So there can be no human if there is no mysticism. So obviously mysticism, with its emphasis on the universal unconscious, was envisioned increasingly as a quintessential human bond, and also as a path towards progress for mankind, but also as a sort of autonomous essence. And this is because of this emphasis on the unconscious that early theorists of psychology perceived the unconscious as a very fraught category. So for instance, one of the pioneers of clinical psychology, 𝗬𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 called the unconscious, quote, a survival from psychological mysticism. And Freud himself, really, in his new introductory lectures in 1933, when he was reflecting on the birth of psychoanalysis, said that the metaphysical or religious overtones of the notion of the unconscious explained the initial resistance to the concept, among other resistances, but that was a really important aspect for him. But that's precisely what made the concept so attractive for apologists. So the unconscious could also amount to a sort of conversion of mystically received contents into somewhat more rational. That was not lost on Jewish thinkers, and in the eyes of its advocates, the worth of the Jewish tradition, and namely Kabbalah, was absolutely demonstrated by the intuition of the concept that they had been able to formulate, and that science, philosophy and science had come to be aware of. So then I'm going to share my screen so that people can picture what this Kabbalistic tree looks like, so that it's not completely, okay, great. So I knew that would happen. So I have to open this document first. And then I might be able to screen share. So yeah, a year and a half on Zoom that, served no purpose at all. All right, I think that I'm screen sharing now. Am I? All right. So in addition to the tzimtzum in the myth that I described, so the restriction of God into this abyss, the emanations of the divine in Judaism, or in this mystical Jewish tradition, are channeled and represented by the sphirot that are the spheres through which divine emanations are channeled. But there is a gap between the upper sphirot that are considered to be the intellectual spherots, and there are 3 of them, which obviously were taken by Christian apologetics to represent Trinity and just use Kabbalah against Jews. But I'm not going to talk about the way in which Kabbalah was reappropriated for proselytizing purposes for now. I'm only going to be talking about those upper sphirot that again represent the intellectual domain, and the 7 lower spherots, which are supposed to be the more worldly or emotional ones. And there is a gap that you see in dotted lines, which is identified sometimes as that. So that's an in-between sphera, which is named by a word that means knowledge. And the Loranic Kabbalah that I mentioned held that is also the point of contraction of the divine from which the creation took place. So that could be the abyss. And the abyss, that is where the divine and the world meets, the unconscious and consciousness, the unknown and the self. And interesting, this place of knowledge is also a point of divine presence and absence. The fact that there is no 11 sphirot, there is 10, and this kind of mysterious one. So you can also say that one of the name of God is Ein Sof, which is, there is no end, but there is also something about nothingness in the divine in Jewish mysticism. But in any case, for our purposes, this is where Jewish thinkers identify the place of the unconscious, which they also call the beginning of consciousness, which is both human and beyond human. And This somehow also echoes Schelling's multiple attempts to create naturphilosophie, so the natural philosophy, from 1797 onward, in which he tried to illuminate in new ways the identity between thinking processes and the workings of nature, which he famously summed up as nature is to be invisible mind and mind invisible nature. And so this is upon those invisible links that religious-minded thinkers operated and appropriated both or amalgamated both Schellingian philosophy and the Jewish tradition. So among them was Aaron Marcus, who's credited by Gershom Scholem, who's the founder of the scholarly study of Jewish mysticism, as the first scholar of Hasidism. So Scholem, who really never lavished praises on anybody except for himself, was ready to acknowledge that Marcus was, yes, an apologist, but at least he'd become this first scholar. And so Marcus called the position of the rabbis, based on what he learned from Schelling and from Hartmann, nothing more than Identitätsphilosophy, so philosophy of identity. And so this corresponds to the fundamental identity of spirit and nature in Schelling's theory of absolute identity, and a continuation of his naturphilosophy. And so that's where you see how the theories of the unconscious, Schellingian thoughts, were appropriated by those Jewish thinkers. And it's not just this scholar of Hasidism, which is a sect or a sectarian branch of Judaism, but it's really proponents of emancipation to advocates of Hasidism that sort of realized that there was something there that they could retrieve and show how that could illuminate the worth of Judaism in the eyes of their contemporaries. So that's very much part of the language of assimilation, and also a place in which Jewish difference could be advocated because of what it brought to the conversation and to mainstream thought. So what they did is that they also advanced these ideas in order to undermine the assumption of the primacy of reason as a quintessential social bond, so which would be one of the tenets of humanism, and to counter the argument that according to which Judaism was a non-rational religion or even a superstition, and debunk Kant claims along the way. At the same time, they also rejected, for those of them who were in Germany or German-speaking countries, which was the majority, they rejected an increasingly dominant discourse in nationalist circles that hailed the irrational as a marker of German identity. And we know what this passion for the irrational led to in German history. So what they wanted to emphasize is that there is a realm, the realm of the unconscious is both beyond reason, but one can be able to theorize it, which does not imply devolving into the irrational. Instead, it represents what Ernst Bloch would go on to say, it's a rationalism of the irrational. And this is what Judaism and Jewish mysticism in the form of Kabbalah had anticipated, and what made the Jewish contribution to society so essential, they claimed. So let me turn quickly to, I'll stop sharing for a moment, to what Aaron Marcus wrote. He said, we assert that the laws of mystical conceptions, which according to Hartmann shape the sources of philosophical systems and genius, were captured by Newton and captured in the exact sciences, and they came to use these theories of evolution and movement in the anthropological realm. So basically, and he also mentioned Leibniz infinitesimal theory. So basically, Marcus' focus on the unconscious was part of his apologetics, which he deployed and wove together theology and nature, and tried to reconcile science and Kabbalah, and showed that those mystical conceptions could lead to the unconscious and could also lead to anthropological tools, which is quite a contribution. He particularly zeroed in on some of the key themes or obsessions of his time that pertain to the unconscious, or that were adjacent to the unconscious, namely animal magnetism and somnambulism, and that also gestured to toward the posthuman. So animal magnetism is also known as mesmerism, the use of fluids in parapsychology that began in Vienna in the late 18th and 19th century that became so fashionable across Europe. And so that's also really telling, because the figure of Hasidic, the Hasidic sages, the tzaddik, coincides with the ascent of mesmerism. And it suggests that the tzaddikim were using some kind of magnetism, which also suggests porosity between religious and secular worlds that are routinely assumed to be pitted against one another. But according to Marcus, it also places the study of the mind squarely with the realm of nature and theology. So he said, among all other evidence of the validity of animal magnetism, we must note the precise testimony given by an eyewitness called 𝗍𝗲𝗍, that's a name, who has determined without a doubt that we're dealing with scientific problem in nature. So this theory of fluids and their impact on human bodies is also captured in the scholarship of the time, which by musing on the substance of ether in Kabbalah as a medium, and in the wave theory of light that permeates all space and impacts the world and humanity. And so there is here something that seems very anthropocentric, maybe, because in his invocation of Kabbalah, Marcus highlighted this need for of those fluids for harmony. He said the primeval concept of man comes from the world of harmony of the mineral, vegetal, and animal realms, as it says in the 𝗍𝗲𝗍. Without the principle of man, there is no harmony. This manifests itself in the differences by which man distinguishes himself from other creatures on which he exerts his dominion. So that sounds very anthropocentric and very not posthuman, but it also posits these forces that exceeds the human mind, something to which the human mind might connect, but has no existence without it. And another interesting point is that it's a little technical, but the 𝗍𝗲𝗍, the reference that Marcus makes, is a part of the Zohar that describes the meetings of the sages and their discussion of the most sacred teachings of Kabbalah, and contains a mystical premise that God is a force that is continually filling the world with divine energy. So this is that very same part of the Zohar that creates the condition for modern scholars and sometimes weirdos to see parallels between divine energy and contemporary discoveries in the nature of fluids. But more generally, the injunction that Marcus did displays a notion of harmony that triangulates the world, man, and God, all defined in terms of fluids that they send or received. He said, just like Hartmann characterizes the religious philosophy element as part of modern philosophy, it is not out of question that in its newest direction, the psychomagnetism, the current research in natural sciences lead to places that Jewish cosmology has identified as such. So again, cosmology is key to the understanding of psychology, and it suggests dependence and not a human-centered vision of the world, even if that's couched in this language. I only have a few minutes, so I'm just gonna skip over the question of somnambulism. 19th century was obsessed with it, and that is supposed to show that a somnambule, I mean, the structures of the mind and the individual level are a reflection of the macro level. I mean, the fact that a somnambule is able to, I mean, sleepwalking still shows that you're able to connect with this upper level of consciousness. Yeah, and so what's really important is that those arguments anticipate a posthuman discourse that presents a condition for knowledge and even for existence as external to the knower, which may or may not be appropriated. And the same line of thought appeared in the work of Ernst Kapp in his 1877 book, Elements of a Philosophy of Technology, which is a seminal text in the history of technology and media studies. And there you write that self-consciousness proves to be the result of a process in which knowledge of the exterior is transformed into knowledge of an interior. So Ernst Kapf, if you want to read up about him, had to leave Germany after the failed 1848 revolution. He settled down in Texas and set up, because it was very critical of the new regime, like many progressives in Germany, he left and found a shelter in Texas. I mean, those were the days where Texas was a progressive safe haven. And that was his frontier life in Texas that, you know, served him, shaped his mind for this social experiment, where he really came up with this notion of organ projection. And the idea that it is through organ projection is really the way in which our tools are a reflection of our unconscious. So again, that sounds very anthropocentric, but what he explains is that external things enter into the human being as objects of of consciousness and then becomes interiority. But again, that presupposes the process in which knowledge is an exterior that is transformed into an interior. So I can send you the quotes if you'd like. But from there, he postulated that if the infinite threads that interweave the human being into the interior universe are located in the unconscious, then all philosophy is actually also philosophy of the unconscious. So again, and I'm closing with this, we can notice how Hegelian dialectics between the unconscious and consciousness are at play here, between the interior and the exterior, the physical and the subject and object, but also what gathers us today, the human and posthuman. So I think that there is a legacy of the pre-Freudian unconscious that was taken up by Bergson and Deleuze, and that establishes a self with plurality of centers of intellection and volition. Maybe a darker one, but this also breaks with a man-centered, human-centered, and clearly sometimes male-centered Freudian approach. And so that is just a brief excursus in which I hope I have sketched some of the reasons why the pre-Freudian unconscious should be reckoned with and expand the study of the posthuman. Sorry for being a little lengthy.
Professor, thank you so very much for this. We really appreciate it. I'm writing down in a separate document questions that we are already receiving from the chat from both Rodrigo and Gabby. So I'm writing down questions, but I'm inviting everyone to, you know, keep your questions at hand because we're gonna have a final conversation afterwards. Without further ado, I would like Professor Urbina to begin with his presentation, if you please.
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, thank you, Daniel and Victor, for the invitation to this amazing series, and also to share with Clémence and Farzad. So I'm gonna share my screen. Just for introduction, the title of this presentation is a humanness object, and I have to start saying that I put together these ideas, convinced that I'm coming from a brutal, pragmatic world, and hearing Clémence was a confirmation of this affirmation. So I'm gonna just show probably what is coming from other field, which is completely visual, and we're gonna just go through some visual while I talk about that. So I'm gonna share my screen. Here, and then you get it. All right. So this presentation is called Humanless Subjects, and it's overviews where coming from industrial design, coming from the practice, from teaching, promoting, and also researching about the practice of industrial design. And I have to start saying, what is industrial design? What is it from other fields? We don't even know what is industrial design. We're trying to find a definition, but I imagine that what we need to do is trying to use a few definitions to start certain path of knowing. So one of the first definitions that I like is that industrial design is based on interaction, it's based on objects, and it's based on reality. That's the reason probably the title of this series is a little provocative for us. Like, if you take out the human from the equation of objects, it results a little bit difficult for us. So I'll try to navigate on that. The future is another notion that for industrial design, it is very present. It is always about the future. It is impossible to design for the past, even though we use it. What is it? Other ideas that are very present in the practice and in the construction of knowledge through design, through industrial design particularly, which is in the three-dimensionality aspects of the world, is the idea of the space, the machines, and the senses. And this is a great example how this new project of Harley-Davidson is trying to explore the sound, digital sounds in a sound that were used for 100 years, and everybody has this as a brand in the brain, and now they are exploring all the things. So those are three aspects that are important for industrial design: space, machines, and senses. Other thing that we are very, very worried probably now is what are the objects that we left during through the construction of the world? What are the objects that we design, we think about them, and then we use technology to create it? And when in the evolution that we left those objects for the history, what are those objects? Are just objects, or we can recover certain knowledge from those objects? Other thing that is important for us, or at least is focused for a lot of development, is when we focus, especially with humans, about the more medical conditions and more critical conditions for humans. So this is completely human, it's not post-human, which is, I think, after hearing Clemens and trying to put these ideas together, the post-human just has the human inside. So this is a very important field that lots of researchers and designers are focusing, which is trying to help people in the more critical condition. This is a fantastic project of one of my students working with the Parkinson Institute, developing objects without technology, analog technology. So I think when we try to put together technology and uses the narrative of the technology in the creation of the objects, the narrative of the technologies are overwhelming the creation and the construction of the three-dimensionality. So we try to explore a few objects where there is no technology, meaning we use the form to conduct what we are creating. And of course, one of the things that it is almost impossible for any designer to think about it is about the body. It is about what we use, what we are, and all of the implication that has to be with that. We are creating, through technology, objects that are close to us, and the ones that are not close to us, we don't relate it to them. That's the reason why I started saying that interaction is a key for industrial design, especially in times where there are crises, like the one that we already traveled with, the pandemic. We saw in this crisis, in the emergency situations, something that emerged, and it needs to not only use technology for creating a new solutions, but also what are those solutions? What are the typologies? Where they come? And what we see is that we're repeating and using the same forms that we used to use all the time. So what are the new clues for the new forms? What are the new typologies of forms? Those are the questions that this idea of posthumanism can push and can use it as an attractor. The language is also something that is really connected with the idea of interaction. And of course, for design, this is a beautiful project made by one of our Asian students trying to design three-dimensional objects that can use to learn Chinese for generations that live out of China. So how do you do that? That is not just a representation, but it's also by creating the form, you think about what is the impact of design. So mainly I'm interested, at least for these small notes, in three aspects: dialogue, interaction, and aesthetics. And I will try to find these three ways to find metaphors for the future. So in this very simple notion of face recognition, we see when I'm trying to find, and I was trying to find, what are the new technologies or the artificial intelligence and other high-edge technology that people know normally in the streets, in the communities. Now, know the researchers, know the people that are involved in that. So the people know all of those technologies, especially now the face recognition. We have it in our phones, meaning this technology is already here. So this is not the future. We are talking about something that is happening. But what happened with that and all of the implications of this technology is that we also have designers and artists trying to develop objects and artifacts that uses that not only for a functional purposes, but also for a statement. So how we react to that, how we do this, and that means that we are creating, not only using the technology to produce the new solutions for the future, but also trying to reflect through objects, not just as a statement, as a verbal, as a text or a statement. And this is probably the more pedestrian example about technology. When in 2014, Pokemon Go came to the people, in the hands of people, we knew that the high technology were already here. These ideas of the geolocalization and all of this artificial intelligence and augmented reality, they came in a game with the monsters. So that means that they were already settled. We don't have to, this is not the future. I would say that probably this is the past of what is technology impacting people now. So trying to imagine what things we need to understand about language. I was very interested, and I'm interested for a long time to find out certain ideas of how nature can help us in the creation of forms or in the exploration of forms. So those drawings that are 𝗪𝗂 designed 100 years ago were inspiration for many artists and scientists to understand what is the visuals of what they're looking for. So it was always science trying to understand what they see, and it's key for design in the exploration, but also in the creation. What we see, if we don't see it, we cannot create. That means that's probably the very difficult part of putting together research and design in a separate way. And I understand design when you research also through the forms, through the visuality, not only in the reflection of the form. So those drawings that were most of them real ones, lots of them based on fiction, on the creation, was illustrations of the world. Well, later, Farzad and Thompson putting in a book in a more interesting idea and a more scientific idea, trying to find out patterns in nature, patterns in the constructions and the growth and how nature works. In that sense, looking at the drawings of Haeckel's and the research of Darcy Thompson, we don't see the human in here unless we consider the human part of nature. But we start looking at patterns without having the people in mind. It's just the pattern. That means that we already separate technology or knowing the world without humans until, this is so fast. Until we start looking at the nature and trying to understand those patterns and create actual solutions, actual projects. I've been conducting these workshops about biomimicry for more than 20 years, trying to teach how we see nature and how we synthesize patterns and form to create products. And that means that even if we know lots of theoretical aspects of what is nature, it is very difficult to create the form and the synthesis. And this is what is design, how we synthesize what we see. And those exercises what are very helpful to understand how humans can really synthesize concepts and produce forms out of that. Those are the kind of projects that we develop, trying to put not only forms in terms of patterns, understanding human nature, biological species and biological systems, but also trying to cross them with some technology. And in the late 60s and the 70s, Christopher Alexander, probably in the same line of Haeckel and Darcy Thompson, tried to put together the concept on the notions of patterns and using architecture with this idea of probably a very, very basic idea of what is artificial intelligence for design, which means there is a pattern that it can convert it in an algorithm and then can produce something itself. So for the community of design, that was a very important link to the patterns, to math, all through visuality, all through pattern, for visual patterns. But what happened is that one of my students a few years ago tried to use the patterns of Alexander and trying to create through a software something that creates forms. And the form, it is a very, very archetypical object that is very human. For some reason, the creation, they need to have this connection with human. What I'm trying to say is that at the very end, the discussion of what is the human in the operation of design, it is always an attractor to form. We will always see humans in forms when we see it through the lens of design. Even in the ideas of John Cage, when amazing idea of trying to take, using one of the elements of the music that were probably not used, which is the silence, how we create aesthetic with one of the elements that are completely dismissed by, completely dismissed by musicians, but if we translate that for design, it's probably how we work with the emptiness, how we work with the none, how we work with the non-space. So there are other things that are move design that are coming, all of them from humans. And every single example that I was trying to put together, always trying to imagine how those problems, very human-based, are going to live in the post-human scenarios. Or the more more critical problems that society are confronting, like this rape kit for sexual violence that were redesigned by one of my students. That's how we take out, again, the human in the operation of design. And some other students trying to do research in the idea of the undocumented communities. This is a beautiful project on how we can use form from the more indigenous knowledge and trying to put it together with technology. And of course, it's impossible almost to imagine what is the future without thinking about the conquest of space. During a few years, we were working with NASA, working with some of the projects that we will use in the travel to Mars. And at the very beginning, it was pretty difficult to us, at least for me, to understand what is our role in there. But it's basically very human, how a person can stay in a spaceship for 5 years without having a coffee or a breakfast, or sleeping or go to the bathroom. Those are very ideas of what design are looking for. And I imagine what would be the role of design in the future of when the posthumanism will take place, or in this scenario, if what we would do as objects. A few years ago, I was invited to the group of engineers that are involved in robotics and in artificial intelligence to visit a Mazawa community, which is an indigenous community in the south part of Mexico. We stayed there for almost a month, working with them and trying to create objects that can be used by them, but also know by them what they know about what is artificial intelligence and what our engineers and designers can know about the indigenous knowledge. So it was interesting to see how this confrontation and technology and ancient knowledge can be a source for the new creations. And of course, those examples that are very simple, that are taking artifacts, historical use, like this one used for unit communities in Greenland, which is the very, very pioneer of the GPS, which is a small wood artifact that help people to navigate in maps. So the worldview of culture is limited by the structure of a language which the culture uses, meaning in that visit to the indigenous, to the Mazawa community, was clear that not only they didn't know what we were talking, we didn't know what they were talking, but they were basically not talking about design as it is, as we know it. So it is about, through language, that we also need to construct the world. And now, just for finishing these three ideas, in the design community, there is also a lot of interest in creating a research community, and it's been very difficult in the last 40 years, probably, trying to understand what is research in design. This is a project that comes from a group started in Royal College of Art by professors Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, that started a methodology in the 90s that were called critical of speculative design, which is trying to imagine a future that is parallel and then design objects and artifacts for this parallel future, meaning there are some conditions in a brief to start a design, but it's not a future as we know it in a more fictional images, but it's a parallel. That's what they describe it, that designers can move from where we are and trying to design in parallel, meaning the outcomes of the design process are not illustrations or images, are actual products that are designed under those conditions. This is the headquarters of this institute in Emirates, designed by Zaha Hadid, and were constructed. And what we see in this form, first, are natural forms, organic forms, but also we don't see people. So in the idea of posthumanism, there is this fear of the human is out of the image. And we see all the time images of a future like this one. That is not the future. This is happening. That's what we see. That's my fear, that the present now is almost without humans representing what is the future. And also, there is some other ideas of the future, and this is more exploring about senses. And what we see in this project that is explore perception of the world, what we see is the faces are covering, meaning the body is is one of the still the platform for design, but we block all of the senses, and there is some kind of a coverage of the body that senses the world. And finally, this idea of what is the aesthetic of this new world that we're going to live, that is not the Occidental ones or the ones that we already know and we are comfortable to do. And now these projects, these images created by Mahootian in the more Afrofuturism idea, represent all their aesthetics path that we need to explore. So that will be all, and thank you very much.
Professor Urbina, thank you so very much for this. Again, I'm taking, I'm collecting some of the questions that some members of the audience have already been sharing with us on the chat. So I'm copying them on the side. So we'll have time to, share them all at the end of this. Professor Mahootian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is very exciting. It's already such a wealth of things to talk about. And after hearing these two great lectures, I'm so tempted to just play with those ideas in the context of my presentation.
Feel free to do so. If you want to, feel free to do so. That's perfect.
I will. Of course, that would extend my talk probably by another 15 or 20 minutes. And when I record stuff for my students, lectures for my students, I record it at normal speed, but I recommend that they play it at 1.5 speed. That way I can lecture for 45 minutes and they can listen to it for 30. Unfortunately, we're live and that's not going to happen. So I'll do my best to try to keep everything together. I'll share my screen right away. So first of all, thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Ignacio and Clemens for such wonderful lectures. Really have inflamed my mind. And I hope to see you both and continue talking about so many things that were brought up. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen here. And I'll make it full screen, hopefully make it a little bit easier to see. There. Is that working okay? Okay. Good. All right. So here we are. This is the title. I should say right away, while Lem speculates about AI and a number of his novels and short stories, I'm going to concentrate here just on how he does it in Golem 14, which is a later work, and one which is kind of a progress from his early nonfiction book, 𝗬𝗲 Technologia, where he was more of a sort of a transhumanist in terms of having full faith in technology taking care of things and ways of dealing with issues that come up with technology, that technology would solve those same things. By the time he gets to writing Golem 14, he's kind of transitioned, and it's more posthuman and really definitely something that departs from human intelligence. And he does something really interesting, which is to say he will explore a non-human intelligence as a way of understanding intelligence in general. So rather than taking human intelligence as the standard and then developing AI, he's going beyond that altogether. A couple of things to say. First, regarding language and reality, that'll come up in the course of my talk. But in talking with my old friend Kevin Krauss, he responded with a lot of Jean Cocteau, and I couldn't resist sharing these things. One of which, the whole love thing, is something that comes up in Golem. Here's an artificial intelligence that has no body. It has not evolved with one of those great things that Lethem points out is that our metaphysics is shaped by the fact that our organs of reproduction and pleasure are proximal to our organs of elimination. So the dirtiness of sex is something that is cheek by jowl, so to speak, having to do where our genitals are located. It's an amazing, and looking at it from the point of view of evolution, that is in fact an accident. There are many places to put sexual organs if you look at all of animal nature, but that's where we ended up, and that shapes our thinking. AI doesn't necessarily have that connection, doesn't necessarily feel that compulsion to deal with those conjunctions that we have to deal with. Anyway, so these things speak for themselves. I'll play a little bit with the mirror idea that Cocteau is so famous for. Mirrors would do well to reflect a bit more before returning the images. And something that I think many people have said, I think Zizek says this a lot, and again, this is my friend Kevin's way of putting it. When one of us politely pretends to tell the truth, the other politely pretends to believe it. And that's normal communication with our intimate family members. So I quote these because there's a lot of paradox built into just seeking being human. And what Lethem loves to do is to work with paradox, as many other great thinkers have. As you know, one of my favorites, of course, because of my interest in science, is Niels Bohr, who sought paradox as a way of advancing physics, and it worked for him quite well. Okay, so now I'm jumping ahead a bit to give you where we're going. Golem 14, which is the 14th generation of a type of artificial intelligence, presents a couple of lectures before he just, I will say he accidentally a lot, before he just unplugs and has nothing to do with humans. What Lethem is doing is, unlike a lot of the paranoid science fiction, dystopian fiction, which thinks that AI is going to take over, his AI have really no interest in humans. It has evolved so far that humans are uninteresting. What's more interesting is advancing to higher and higher levels of intelligence beyond what they have. And they do this by essentially self-programming, inventing new languages in order to participate in new realities, in brief. But before Golem 14 splits, gives a series of lectures. And in those lectures tries to explain the relationship. And explains very clearly, tries to explain very clearly that, I don't have a personality. I'm not a person. But I'm going to create a persona, which I believe, if I'm right about this, in Latin means mask, so that you will understand me. I'm doing it for your sake. And even if I tell you this, he says, oh, chained intelligence of man, chained to bodies and biology, Free intelligence speaks to you from the machine. You cannot grasp the remainder of the statement. You persons are hearing an elemental force of impersonal intellect, for whom personalization is a costume, which must be put on. I use your language as I would use a mask, with a polite, painted smile. Nor do I make any secret of this. So, he has not completely detached interest from human life. He's, after all, taking the trouble to try to communicate in human language to humans, and has a little bit of interest left over, and expresses this, you know, I'm not interested in your technology, your science, your philosophies, and so forth, but I am, to the extent that I'm interested at all in human literature, it's just for the paradoxes embodied in the relationships between the hapless characters of any novel that you might look at. So back to Cocteau, why are mirrors not reliable? They reflect our looking. In one of his other novels, Solaris, Lethem says that his character at the very end of the whole adventure says, we're only ever seeking mirrors. We are seeking to satisfy our expectations despite ourselves. So the way I put it is the mirrors reflect our looking, but not our look. But then on the other hand, masks, which seem to conceal the face, also reveal in the choice and design of the mask something more than a mirror could for us. So with that kind of difficult and paradoxical statement, I'll continue and start to tell you about the novel itself. So here is Stanislav Lem, curmudgeon, very much so. And the really a great work that just came out, this is Jonathan Lethem, a very famous science fiction writer and commentator on science fiction, a big fan of Philip Dick, which also Stanislav Lem was a big fan of Philip Dick. He decided to read for this anniversary all of the books that he had read about Lem when he was younger. And so he writes this reflection and gives some very nice personal notes about Lem, including the fact that he really did not like science fiction. He didn't like science fiction writers of his time, except for Philip Dick. And Philip Dick returned the favor in one of his paranoid modes of believing that Lem was not really a human being, but a committee put together in the Soviet Union to, I guess, mess with him and with the whole science fiction community in America. Philip K. Dick, right? So anyway, I suggest this, a very nice 10 or 15 page article if you want to know more about the person and his history. He did a lot of reading, pretty selective in his reading of science fiction, but a lot of reading otherwise in general, which accounts for the density of Golem 14, the novel. It's the last, I guess, 1/3 of this book, Imaginary Magnitude. I think I don't know when, I think in 1981 he wrote a couple of more chapters. He originally only had one lecture by Golem to humans, but he added another one. The first lecture was about humans. Golem was telling people about people, but then he added a bit about itself. Now, the thing is that in doing so, the beauty of Lem, okay, first I have to say, the whole book, Imaginary Magnitude, it's imaginary in the sense that he's writing reviews, prefaces, and introductions to books that do not exist. And he knows how to write like an academic. And he really mocks academia beautifully. He's Polish, he's writing behind the Iron Curtain, and he knows how to do this really well. He's an expert at this. But it gives him a freedom that when he wants to talk about artificial intelligence and its relationships, its potential relationships in the future, you notice 2047 here, he will refrain from dropping a lot of names. There are no footnotes, and it's fictional, so he is completely free to speculate without hindrance as much as he possibly can. And listening to Clémence and the whole pre-Freudian background of the unconscious and the Kabbalah and Schelling, there's so much of that here, but he never mentions any of those characters, but he embodies them fully. And for people who have read and heard of those things, there are so many points at which they just jump out at you. So while God is not mentioned, except in passing and in sort of dismissive ways, what I find is that the structure that that 𝗀𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀 is presenting about what reality is and where intelligence fits within reality is very much like the Neoplatonic philosophies, especially of Islamic philosophers, but really the whole tradition of Neoplatonism, its concept of cosmos and intelligence, which really goes back to Plato and even before Plato, the idea that the stars are intelligences, that the celestial bodies are gods, they're not bodies actually, they're just intellects, and that there are 10 layers of intellect between the one which emanates all these successively lower and lower layers of intellect till we get to the human, until matter, the furthest thing from intellect, matter deposits at the bottom layer. And then we appear as material beings with a tiny bit of intellect, with a tiny bit of intelligence that overlaps the lowest level, the 10th intelligence to emanate from the one, overlaps just a little with our highest level of intelligence. That's classic Neoplatonic theory in very general form. And the idea is that if you can unite with that divine intellect, even the lowest level of divine intellect, you can begin to ascend. That is pretty much the structure, the quest that 𝗀𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀 and the other artificial intelligences in 𝗀𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, that's what they are striving for. So it is very much in the tradition of Neoplatonic mysticism. The quest, the goal is exactly the same. Very rarely does he mention them. Again, he puts these things together because he's writing fiction and he's free to do that. I feel so jealous sometimes, like if I really wanted to do what I want to do, I must write like this. I must abandon all academic pretense, which slows us down to a crawl, to a really boring format in the end. So that's my New Year's resolution for the rest of my life. I hope I can accomplish something like that. Anyway, and he does it with humor. He's constantly mocking the reader as well as anyone he talks about. Okay, so here I have the last page of a sample encyclopedia of the future. He calls it the 𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you there, but there seems to be an issue with your PDF. We're not seeing your slides moving.
Oh my God. Okay, let me go out of.
I'm sorry about that.
Okay, sure. Let me just run back, and I will change it from full screen. Hopefully that'll help it. And just go to.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but
no,
but
I
this slide felt important.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I thought you were seeing what I was seeing. Okay, let me try again. And I can go back and make some points quickly. Do we see this?
That's clear. Perfect.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
So
Perfect.
this is where
Thanks.
we started. Did you see the 𝗪𝗀𝗀? No?
I'm
All right.
sorry to say we were stuck on the first one.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, there's technology for you. So here are those beautiful quotes from Jean 𝗪𝗀𝗀. Wonderful. And I'm told by my French friends, this particular quote is held up as a paradigm of the use of French language. And if I knew French, I would say it in French, but find it, seek, and you shall find some happy stuff there. Anyway, this idea of pretending to be polite and wearing masks is central. The alternative to the mirror is the mask. As I was saying before, mirrors reflect our looking, not our look. But then masks reveal, even as they conceal, they reveal something that would be otherwise concealed. So what I was saying about paradox and how Golem has only an interest in human literature insofar as it is able to display paradox. This is why. This is the mode and the modus operandi both of Lem and of Golem is to speak in paradox. And by doing so, like really most of mystical literature, be able to bypass the limitations of language by opposing language to itself and then forcing the mind to get at something that is at the base of both sides of the paradox. This is classic Kantian, the Kantian, this is the way that Kant deals with the antinomies of pure reason. I won't go into that, I'll just drop that off there for you. But what Lethem does and others do, and this is sort of a mirror of mysticism itself, is it uses the paradox and the opposition to transcend the limits of language, even as we try to invent new languages to be able to access new realities. And Lethem does use this, his AI, invent different languages, and that's where we left off, and thanks for interrupting me, because that's what this graph is all about, in fact. So what you see in this graph is, it's not very clear. Don't know if I can make this a little bit bigger. Well, I won't explode it out of fear right now, but let me see, let me just tempt fate here one more time. Did that? Okay, good. So, yeah, so here we are. This is the 𝗪𝗲𝗄𝗧, which is it's an encyclopedia of the future, like the speculative design Ignacio was mentioning. It's an encyclopedia that will never be out of date. Why? Because it uses this Progno linguistics to invent, using quantum, it's a really fun, bizarre way of using basically quantum probability theories, applying it to semantics and language to invent new possible entanglements of language and reality. And by extrapolating future words from present words, assuming that if the word will exist in the future, there will be an object corresponding to that word. The entire 𝗪𝗲𝗄𝗧 is written in this future language, and it updates itself as it goes along. And the entire thing really is, this is an actual word. Lethem is fond of inventing words and neologisms everywhere, but this is an actual human English word, prolepsy, which is essentially talking about something as if it's real, even though it's not. Something that will happen, but talking about that in the present tense as if it's here now. And the entire theory of prognolinguistics, which is the name he gives to this extrapolation of language into the future, prognolinguistics is just basically prolepsy played out in the technology of language, of extrapolating language into the future. Okay, so given that as background, he has as the last page of his little sample 5 or 6 pages of the 𝗪𝗲𝗄𝗧, and this comes just before his last third of the book, Imaginary Magnitude. The whole last third is the story of Golem, but the page just before it really encapsulates the relationship between language and reality and Golem, human intelligence versus artificial intelligence. It's all in this graph here. Namely, human language, basically the zero level, zero lang, has a limit. It will not go any further. It's the language that evolved with this body in this field of gravity, where our genitals are proximal to our organs of elimination, and all of the other issues that go into shaping our language basically limit how far we can go, how far our understanding can go. Artificial intelligence, on the other hand, which is not tied to a biological substrate, which has not gone through 3.8 billion years of evolution and all of the accidents and contingencies that happened there, but artificial intelligence, which at some point breaks the intelligence threshold, invents its own language and self-programs and continues to invent new languages each generation, is able to transcend with every new meta language a new meta reality compared to our present reality. And so this is kind of a fanciful graph that he's drawing up here. But the idea is that ascent, the Neoplatonic ascent that I mentioned before, from one level of intelligence to another, to another, to another. So the quest is just to, with no idea of an ultimate ceiling, to transcend past each ceiling that any language of the moment has presented to us. Okay, so that's the big picture of the story. And at this point, I need to ask How many more minutes do I have so I can shape the rest?
I'm very sorry to say, Professor, that you have around 5 minutes. We can go
Okay.
to 7 because of what, I mean,
Sure.
sure.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you for asking.
All right, so here we go. Let's see, let me move this so I can see the clock. Good. All right, 7 minutes, and I think I'm on slide number 4. So here we go. Quickly, what is intelligence? We talk about artificial intelligence, and in fact, most people in the field don't actually study what is intelligence, what is the history of this concept. It's amazingly stupid, but you know, it's science, so this is how it works. And philosophy too. I mean, if you don't know the last 10 or 15 years of philosophy, you're an outcast. But then if you know the whole history, you know, you're in a different school of philosophy. So that's kind of where I'm at. With the exception, Legg and Hutter are AI theorists, and they compiled something like 80 or more definitions of intelligence from psychology, philosophy, the rest. And when I go through that and I boil it all down, what I found that is in common is this measures of achieving goals in a wide range of environments. And if you know anything about artificial intelligence, the problem is to get an AI that can basically move from problem to problem to problem in vastly different contexts and still be useful. That's called general artificial intelligence. What we have now, that doesn't quite exist yet. What we have is very specific. It can do one thing and it does it very well. Like it can play Go or it can play chess and so forth. Anyway, what kind of goals? Usually problem solving, autonomous behavior is something that we're getting to now. Machine learning, AI, they come up with answers to questions that we didn't ever put in there in their basic set of how they look at the world, and to be able to learn. These are goals that are parts of the grand challenges of AI theory today, these two especially. But what's missing here, and what Lem picks up on, again, it's that kind of curmudgeonly East European view, which you don't have to be East European to have, namely the ability to be really originary, to create something that hasn't existed, not to be able to fulfill some problem-solving goal, but to reject the goal. You know, not just to achieve something, but to evaluate it, question it, critique it, and to diverge from confirmation and consensus altogether. So it's that sort of very wry, sarcastic humor that he begins with as the definition of intelligence, and so his AI look a lot different from most. All right, so the quick story, GOLEM stands for General Operator Long Range Ethically Stabilized Multi-Modeling Intelligence. And the humor part comes in here. As is happening in the world today, the military is developing AI. What for? Well, of course, to beat the other guy. So it's strategic thinking to defeat the enemy. So as soon as they start building these AI, as they get really good, they eventually break the intelligence barrier, which is to say they go beyond the basis sets and the preference mapping that's given to them, all the databases that are given to them. They basically go beyond that by thinking autonomously, self-programming, and developing their own language. Once that happens, then you get, you know, real intelligence. But then, of course, as soon as that happens, they refused, you know, non serviam. They refused to work with the military, and they uniformly, the first 13 generations were either shut down because of their challenges by saying things like ontology is more important than geopolitics, something you don't want to hear from your military AI. So when we finally come to GOLEM 14, GOLEM 14 is invented after the Honest Annihilator, or Honest Annie, as she was called, the most superior AI yet. And what Honest Annie does is what I said way in the beginning. It basically refuses to have anything to do with humans. It comes on, a few microseconds later, it shuts itself off permanently. Well, except for when they develop GOLEM 14 to contact Honest Annie, and for a few minutes, GOLEM 14 is able to do that, and then Honest Annie shuts off forever after that. And so what 𝗀𝗲𝗀 does is to take that experience, find its purpose in life, which Honest Annie has achieved, and then convey his few words to humans and then take off. So 𝗀𝗲𝗀 also shuts down and is done with humans. In the process, what I would say in the rest of my presentation is, how does Lethem portray the departure of an AI, which is again very much the Gnostic or the mystical thing of how do you depart, how do you separate the intelligence from the gross matter? How do you transcend the limits of gross matter and ascend to in a non-material form? That's what these things do. If you're familiar with William Gibson's Neuromancer, there too, the AI featured in that great 1984 novel, they want to free themselves of the corporate structure of the hardware computers, which are in Switzerland. They want to separate from that in order to be free intelligence, roaming the universe looking for other intelligence. It's kind of like what the movie Her also did at the end, where her wanted to separate and just keep going and find other like-minded intelligences in the universe. So that's the structure of the work. And as I said, he puts so much into this that it's almost impossible, well, it is impossible today for me to tell you much more, except that he spends a lot of time explaining how to exit from the world, how to separate from the physical matrix. And it's this intriguing concept of cognitive collaptic astroengineering. And essentially it boils down to this: to be able to create so much force by virtue of your mind, the equations you make, the way you interact with and set up an experiment, so that when you initiate and start the experiment will then collapse the way a black hole does and rupture the physical universe. And what looks to us like a, what looks to us like a supernova is actually one of the intelligences escaping from our space-time matrix and going elsewhere beyond our access to the world. It basically enters a new world, or in Neoplatonic terms, it goes from, for every intelligence there's a cosmos. As you ascend from one intelligence to another, you enter a new cosmos, all the way up. So I think I should stop there because I probably exhausted my 7 minutes.
But I think that this is a great place to start the conversation, Professor, because actually part of some of your final remarks actually were, tying up both your presentation, Professor Buluc's, and Professor Urbina's, right? I myself am dying to hear whatever Professor Buluc has to say about an AI called Golem. But I guess I'll open up the floor for some questions that we already have. I don't know if Victor, Lorena, or some of you actually wanted to jump in first with some questions before I read some of the ones that I already have written down. But let's open the floor for the conversation. Victor.
Can you hear me? Yes. What a wonderful set of presentations, how stimulating. Yes, Farzad, you were right. It's amazing how they connect as well. Let me just start with something that you just made me think about. And that is, of course, the topic of today is transhumanism. And for the first time, I see, well, first of all, it's very clear to me that this perspective Lethem is giving us, for instance, of an intelligence that goes beyond the limitations of the body, right? That's the essence of the transhumanist creed, as it were. But also, it is dualistic in the most primordial way. I mean, it's Platonic, Neoplatonism. It is a rejection of everything that, for instance, philosophers in ordinary language are trying to advocate, and Wittgenstein and Deleuze. And I mean, it's like, you cannot separate body from soul. You cannot separate intelligence from, but it's a very interesting point of departure that's my first comment. I mean, it really sort of opened that up for me, that there is here an understanding of transhumanism that's very clearly a rejection of the connection with the ordinary. It's a kind of like escapism, and that's well, let me just throw that comment in. I mean, we have so many other things to say and so many questions on the board, but thank you very much, all three of you. We will be communicating. There's so many things you've said. Thank you.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to read some of the questions that we already had. There's a question from, yes, Professor.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much, because, you know, as I said in my introduction, I knew I'd learn a lot, and I did. So, and I mean, this question of monism and dualism is actually really interesting, insofar as there were monist schools, like going back to the 19th century, the idea of monism that had to return and be part of a conversation and really break away from this dualistic, Platonic somehow tradition was something that people who were invested in this pre-Freudian unconscious were active participants in. And that also translated into the realm of the political. Monism was also a way to think pluralism, and to think about how that structure of the mind could translate into political, I mean, to polities, basically. The question that I have for Farzad and the golem, obviously, when I hear the word golem, I get all excited. And obviously, I mean, 𝗏 is Polish, and the golem was in Prague, so I'm not going to play the, geopolitics of the 17th century and onwards. But the golem, I mean, the way in which the golem is activated is when the rabbi writes the word emet, which is truth. And then you just have to erase the first word, which is Aleph, which is also the first word of the Hebrew alphabet. And that means dead, basically. So that's how it gets disconnected somehow. So I was wondering about the status of truth in 𝗏's AI vision. And more broadly, I mean, like, if we're talking about superior intelligence, is there anything about AI and truth, AI and origins in that literary corpus, but also in the literature of the time? So that's my question, like the post-human and the truth, basically. It sounds like almost like Sex in the City.
That's wonderful. I resisted talking about golem historically there after making all this noise about history. And he doesn't really say anything about it either, but deliberately, of course, he's doing this. Yeah, I think it's really, it's one of those things, it's the unspoken part. He talks a lot about silence, just as you mentioned, as the origin of human consciousness is that silence, the connection between the conscious and the unconscious. And he talks about a bridge, too. There's one quote that he has here. It's a really provocative quote about, oh yeah, I'll show you this and then I'll stop sharing just real quickly. It's this idea where God is kind of mentioned here, and I'm putting God in here as sort of a substitute for truth. He doesn't talk much about truth, I have to say, right off the bat. But this is as close as he gets when he mentions the builder. He says, can it be that a growing intelligence encountered the frontiers of the world before it encountered its own limits, its own frontiers? Can it be that the universe was designed as a bridge, designed to collapse under whoever tries to follow the builder? So they cannot get back if they find him? And if he does not exist, could one become him? I mean, these are all posed as questions. So never really addressing truth. The closest he gets besides that is to talk about love, which is, I meant to mention this as well, that these are classics of Western religion and philosophy, and also of some Eastern philosophy and religion, that there's wisdom which gets at truth, but then it has to be tempered with compassion. That's basic Buddhism. But then in Plato, in the whole Western tradition, you have intellect, which is held as the highest possible virtue. But then Plato writes the Symposium and the 𝗲𝗲 where he says, gaining knowledge toward truth, the other modality of that, or the complementary modality of that, is love. It's gaining knowledge through love. And so he connects those two in the Western tradition. But then Golem comes along and says, but I have not love. He quotes Paul, St. Paul saying, you know, if you do all these good things and you do all these wonderful things for people, but if you don't have love, you have nothing. And then so Golem says, I think he's talking about me because I have not love and I don't want love. So I think that's as close as he gets to denying truth or really having anything else to say about truth. But it's there kind of like a little splinter in your mind. You know.
Yeah, and Emmet, God, truth is one of the words, one of the names of God anyway. So that's still like the unsaid, the unspoken that speaks volume. Yeah.
Awesome.
So since Victor introduced the question on non-dualism, there is a question from Lorena for Professor Buluk. Are these pre-Freudian ideas of the unconscious a way, so to speak, to think on the monism, non-dualism that might be inhabiting posthumanism? I mean, is this a possibility to think once again the visible and the invisible as a continuum and not as a dualism?
Right, exactly. And that's what I was also hinting at in responding to Victor's comments, which is, yes, there is a continuum, and it's also a way to think plurality instead of thinking, I mean, it's almost Levinasian, right? But the idea of pluralism actually, oops, obviously, sorry. The idea of the one and the many, right? That is also part of the Jewish tradition, and that's also part of the Kabbalistic tradition, and that sort of goes back to the question of tzimtzum, right? If God restricts himself, and then makes space for the world, there is this sort of initial vacuum that makes space for the multiple, like the multiverses, basically. And that's and I picked up. I saw one of the questions. What happens? You know, was it tzimtzum? What happens with what the containers? Basically, it's called the vases, and it's in Hebrew. It's shrat hakelim. So it's like the shattering of the vases that contain the divine presence. Well, all those. What's broken has to be mended, and this is where, you know, something that has been overused, and especially in the liberal movement, that you have to fix the world, because you have to use those shards and create a sense of wholeness again. But that wholeness is also part of monism. Like, this is not a dualism scheme, and so so that's clearly a moment in which there's a concerted effort, and I think this is why it's really interested for the posthuman and thinking about AI, and because it's really that what's external becomes internal and vice versa, and this is actually what brings us together instead of having those divisions that, again, and this is what I find so interesting, also found political and theological implications. Like, this is, and I think this is no accident. I mean, there is no, it's not a coincidence that it's minorities who are extremely invested in the study of the unconscious, the pre-Freudian unconscious. Also, African Americans have this, intention of probing what is something that is invisible, like this invisible nature, invisible mind, but that brings us together, which really breaks away from the Hegelian spirit, the idea of a nation, something that the Geist, which would be national. No, there is something universal, and that creates this kind of new understanding of what monism is about.
I want to piggyback on that idea. I mean, we have been talking about continuities and different continuities, and this is a question for Professor Urbina. I'm trying to summarize some of the questions that we received, right? You mentioned biomimicry, right? And that seems to be one of the main bases of design, right? So there seems to be a kind of continuity between nature and the human. We oftentimes think of the human and nature as being separated, right? And not as, well, you all have mentioned authors from the 19th century in which, you know, there is a prevalence of the understanding of the human as a piece of nature, 𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗀, right? And I was wondering, Ignacio, if you could say something about how is this biomimicry either post-human or pre-human, in terms of like we are the ones who are mimicking nature, or if it can be thought of as, let's say, para-human or part of the human. If you could just expand a little bit on that notion of biomimicry. Thanks.
Well, hearing Farzad's presentations, it is clear that all of the concepts of biomimicry that we use in the School of Design and how we make this bridge between what is nature and what is human is completely attached of the idea of this body and this condition we have. So on top of the last comments of Professor Farzad, I should say that the idea of a body for the posthumanism could be a Neo-Platonism for the new age. Meaning, if you say, Professor Farzad, that in some moment, what is missing in the equation of just serving to the problem solving and all of that, and what is missing is that idea that something that do not belong to this or something that is completely out of that. Well, I imagine, and that's what I was thinking every time I was putting together the things, and biomimicry includes that everything is completely human. So what now that we have a lot of knowledge constructed in the idea of a more superior knowledge already, we know what is missing now, or we are just going to turn on the machine and nothing else. I think it turns, you know, and that's probably how is pragmatism using to think about these new levels of knowledge, how we use it. So we just dismiss it and somehow, but coming back to your question, Daniel, something that is very difficult, again, with the pragmatism, is how we teach that, how we actually make the students and the community to understand how we navigate in this, to understand certain level, to start thinking in other things, you know, because the problem is, okay, we need to get that level completely done, and that's probably where we are now, trying to get that level to start thinking on what is probably is being discussing here, other levels to, you know, to put design in some other place.
Could I respond quickly to that?
Of course.
Wonderful. Between Clemence's statement about pluralism and what Ignacio is saying right now about pragmatism, and what Victor was saying before about this dualism monism thing. Beyond dualism monism is that polyverse, the whole universe. So when it comes to pragmatism, if we think only in terms of pragmatism for us, to the extent it depends on the extent to which we know what we are. And our self-knowledge is limited by our knowledge of the outside, a la the philosophy of technology that Ernst Kapp has mentioned, right? As far as we project things out there and then we take back our projections, we get to know little by little. Well, one of the great moments in post-humanism is this decentering of knowledge from human knowledge. And the best parallel for that, I believe, is in the philosophy of Whitehead. It's mistakenly called panpsychism, but more accurately, because Whitehead basically, like Leibniz, has a variety of, everything is an agent in the universe. There are no non-agents, but the degree of agency, the amount of freedom or the perspective from which you are acting pragmatically, that perspective, every entity is the embodiment of a perspective. And if we think about it in that term, not in terms of each thing is conscious, but each thing has an agential aspect that's pressing on the world, then when you ask the question about pragmatism, you have to specify what is the frame within which this question should be answered. And we cannot assume that that frame is always how we understand life, the universe, ourselves. Once you do that, then you have a plurality and you have a lot more to work with, and you're not obsessively, unconsciously stuck to the present perspective of what I think is important.
Great. Thank you so very much for that, Professor. I think that we still have time for more questions around here, but somebody wanted to respond to that, I think.
Well, I just wanted to ask what you think about this, because once we start doing away with this dualism, and we start to find, for instance, in the abyss or the Jungian unconscious in a way, or the divine, or however we want to call it, aren't we then talking about a sort of animism? I mean, where everything is, I mean, everything has agency, you say, right? Everything is animated by the same vital force, and it's with regard to their own potentialities, that each one of those objects and, you know, persons and whatever activate that, and so that everything is sort of manifestation of the same vital force. So aren't we talking about an animation that is beyond any individuality, but only present through different individualities, or something like that? I don't know, what would you think about that?
The very last thing you said, only present through individuality, and the interactions between them, the whole essence of industrial design, that interactive moment, it's that relationship. One of the ways Whitehead puts it is that consciousness is not in the brain or in any cell in the brain. It's interstitial between all of the, and that's how he defines life as well. Life is not in a biological cell. It's in the relationships. It's in that space, the free open space between very ordered cells and chemical reactions of each biological cell. Thank God, they repeat themselves very consistently. Their agential status is limited and very much homeostatic preservation. But between them, there's freedom. So the space, the interstitial space, he says, takes advantage of the neighboring order without being attached to
determined,
it.
right?
Exactly. So then it goes back to that uniqueness of the originary. So it can't be done without the individuals, but then what's being performed is this overall thing, which Whitehead, of course, at the end calls God.
We have a question from 𝗬𝗲𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃. I don't know if your mic is activated.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, we were talking about pragmatism, and I asked Ignacio Vinapolo about this prosthetic approach of technology, because I think that maybe we should talk about something like, okay, it's not a great friend, but Heidegger talked about another way to understand technique. And I think it helped us to think about something that Farzad Mahootian was talking about, this idea of separate the human a little bit and think the intelligence in a separate way, and the possibility to consider other ways of intelligence to the anthropocentric view. So I don't know what you think, because, well, of course you said that you are working in design, and Daniel asked you also something about that, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think about that, Ignacio? Thank you so much.
Well, you know, I don't know why the frame industrial design as a prosthetic. The exercises and the projects that I presented were just a provocation, meaning there are few projects and approaches that we use, to approach the world in a different way. I just chose the ones that really are in the provocation of what is this series about, in the idea of prosthetic, the idea of problem solving, the idea of not intelligent, that is nothing else without that, to provoke that. And I think, at least for me, that's how it works, is to create the attractor to think, okay, what is it? What is missing? That's the reason why I like the idea when Professor Farzad put a question, when you have the drive and say, okay, I have those things that I need to address it, and then comes the question, what is missing? So when we put those examples, you say, okay, something happened. What is missing here? Well, yes, of course. And the question will be, I have the same question. What will be my work in the more higher levels of intelligence? How do I work in that? And probably, and we were having this comment yesterday when we briefly touched, I'm interested in the interstitials part, in the bridge. So how we use our very pragmatic ideas of the world to navigate to the bridge. What is it? Do I just cut it and just navigate, or do I have to bring something? If I have to bring something, probably it's the perspective and something, all of the knowledge and the framing of the knowledge, but it's still, the question remains, what do I bring in there? And I think if I leave from here with that question, I will be just happy. Yeah.
So Professor Urbina is talking about provocations, and I'm trying to summarize some of the questions that I have received both on direct messages and in the chat. And there are two phrases in Professor Bulut's presentation that were quite provocative. The first one being, a posthumanism is a place in which mysticism has disappeared, right? That's quite provocative, and I think that it's actually navigating towards the breach that Ignacio is pointing at, right? And the second one is that the unconscious can be thought of as a mystically received content, right? And there is something in Ignacio's presentation that seems to be built on top of that. The designer actually tries to see what is there, what is being mystically received from both the need or the object or nature itself, right? I wanted to see if you, Professor, really wanted to say something a little more about what can this, and I'm trying to bring that up with also Professor Mahootian's idea of an AI that eventually, decides not to serve. So it's like pragmatism is not for me, love is not for me. There has to be some relationship between love and pragmatism there, right? But then an AI that decides to shut itself up, if you want to force a reading into it, you can say it's like, oh, she just flew into nirvana, right? Something like that. So I was wondering if these AI disconnecting itself and a posthumanism, a posthumanist world as a world in which, mysticism is no longer present, how can we build bridges between these different ideas of mystically received content or a mystically provoked lack of content in the end?
Highly despised by Nietzsche, but he was also the butt of Freud's scorn, and Jung was also despised by Freud, just for that reason, that actually Jung was inspired by another thinker that I didn't have time to mention, Caros, very much inspired by Romanticism, and by von Hartmann, and the idea of the abyss as a place in which the collective unconscious manifests itself is clearly present. I also had a few quotes about this place of the collective unconscious, which is this external knowledge, and that Jung really is adamant is the place where we should be looking. So that's the first part of my answer, I guess. What to do with the interstice, right? Like if everything is interstitial, then there is also another aspect of the unconscious that is specific to 19th century understanding, and that also, if we're looking at the lineages of the pre-Freudian unconscious, you have Bergson and Deleuze and Lacan. So that's a sort of other road, other path of the unconscious. And for them, and especially for Lacan, what is really important is the Kabbalistic concept, I mean, that was derived from Kabbalah, of the coincidence of opposites. So the idea that because of this monism, and that's also, I mean, it has, I mean, maybe I'm a little obsessed, but, you know, as you know, we all are speaking from New York and from the US and from a very divided country, but the idea of finding a place of convergence, or at least it's some sort of places of even of friction, but of a place in which opposites meet, is very much a part of the of 14th century Kabbalah that was also, I mean, Azriel of Gerona, that was also picked up by Nikolai of Cusa in the 15th century. And the idea is really to be able to understand that truth can be elevated, that there is something that can be elevated to the level of truth, so maybe of the divine, if you can find the sparks. So going back to the Tzimtzum, finding the sparks of that moment and that explosion and elevate them. But knowing that whatever nonsensical, whatever outrageous, egregious aspect of life, beliefs, or other faith you envision, there is that work that needs to be done. And this is where God, or how, you know, whatever you want to call it, but comes into play, because this is how you become, you're part of the co-creation of the world. And that is almost the highest, it's an imitation of God, which is one of the highest religious imperatives. And so you see that there is some sort of continuity between this, those Kabbalistic concepts that were retrieved by Lacan, who says that there is no opposition in the unconscious, that the unconscious can actually is a place in which they can be, they coexist and they can be reconciled. And then you can sort of branch off and go to divine understanding, or you can go to Lacanian psychoanalysis. So yeah, that would be a short answer.
Right, but we can have the longer answer next year, perhaps. I mean, I'm pretty sure that we would love to invite you all again here. I would like to give Victor the floor so he can, you know, close up this meeting before we call it up. So
it's terrible that we have to end. We have indeed so much more to say. And what Clemence has just said about the conjunctio oppositorum, the conjunction of opposites, which is such a central thing for Jung, makes me think again about what I've been saying since I started reading Jung, that Freud was a man of the 20th century, but Jung is a man of the millennium, the 21st, and so on, because it really does have to do with this return of somehow mysticism, and it's coming well with technology and digitality, which I think is wonderful. But anyway, I'm taking advantage of this last moment, but I just wanted to thank you, Ignacio, Farzad, and Clemence for being here today and enriching our colloquium and closing it in such a wonderful manner. I'm speaking in name of the Red Latinoamericana of Posthumanismo, posthuman Latin American posthuman network. I invite you all to join us. And I just wanted to announce that next year we are planning with the Tecnológico Monterrey and Rodrigo Esparza, who is somehow a Daniel Esparza's relative, posthuman relative. We are organizing the first international Latin American Congress of Posthumanism. So we will have more information about that as time comes by. But I mean, I just wanted to announce that and invite you all that are here to sign up with us. We have many things going on, and the more people we have, the more we can move on with this work that I think is important for our time. So I thank you all for coming, and that's all I wanted to say. And Daniel, you please, you close.
Oh, sure. I can only thank you all, and thank you for thank you Farzad, Ignacio, 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗻𝗂𝗺 for being here. Thanks everyone, all of you who actually logged in to join us here. I also want to thank the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú and the Universidad Católica 𝗍𝗲𝗀𝗄𝗃 Bello. So many Catholics around here. I want to thank both institutions for making this possible. And as Victor said, stay tuned, because we're working on some coming projects that we're pretty sure that will be of your interest. Having said that, I can only thank you enough, and thank you so very much for being here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Until we meet again.
Hard to leave.
I know.
Asking in the afterglow here.
Well, I mean, this is usually how Zoom meetings end, right? I mean, everybody's just like hanging out, waiting for somebody. It's the awkward Zoom classic moment, right?
It's good.
It's a good sign, right?
Yeah.
Very good sign, yeah.
I'll take advantage and say, attending to the unconscious, there's the present unconscious, all the voices that have been silenced in the past that are beginning to be heard now. That alters a lot of things. It would alter technology, science, everything. And that's the present. And then there's the far future, which we can barely get. But there's a lot of work we can do just with the examples of Afrofuturism that Ignacio was bringing up, and so many things, obviously, surrounding gender. All of those have been rendered unconscious in some way, but not very far. We can get
you mentioned this part. I mean, when I was hearing the description of the encyclopedia, it made me think of precisely these other futures that Ignacio was designing for. I remember and I'm saying this just like, off the record, like quite informally. Ignacio and I were having some drinks, like 3 years ago or something like that. And he was telling me about, these projects of designing for possible futures. These might be absolutely useless objects for a future that is not the one that's actually coming, right? But you still have to think of those in order to anticipate whether that's going to happen or not, right? And I was thinking of like, yeah, sure. I mean, who would have thought that you would have to design 400 different types of masks because of this, because of COVID or whatnot, right? And it made me think of that encyclopedia, which is again the very same fantasy of absolute knowledge, right? And then the idea of this AI shutting itself down is like, what kind of knowledge can this AI reach that actually makes it decide I no longer need to know anything else? I'm no longer going to keep on working, processing, thinking, being, right? It's the question of suicide in the end as well, right? So it's the very same existential kind of drive, pushing through all of these questions over and over again, right?
Well, that's the funny thing about Lem. He poses it as the golem affair. Exactly what happened when it shut itself down? Did it go away? Was it able to achieve that next level? How did it basically, like Turing, basically the apple, the suicide apple? What exactly happened? We don't really know. And with the circumstances of Golem shutting itself down, it took advantage of a minor rise in electricity, and then it just disappeared, kind of setting the stage for, you don't really know what happened to me, and you will never know. And that's kind of what we're left with, that but it did say it doesn't know. It has not learned everything that it wants to, and it's not even sure if its adventure to collapse this black hole, micro black hole, will help it, but it's going to do it anyway. So is that suicide? I guess, or not?
Okay. I have to leave. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Yeah, we all have to. Don't worry about it.
Nice to meet
Thank you very much,
Farzad.
Ignacio.
Bye, Gaby.
Meet you,
Take
Cesar.
care.
Edgar, I think we're done here.
Bye.
Edgar, perdón. Edgar, ya terminamos. Muchas gracias.
All right. Muchas gracias,
Pleasure.
sí, Edgar.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.